Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome into another our series of our virtual events that we started almost a year ago at the beginning of the global pandemic. Before we begin tonight, I'd just like to remind you of a few things. This is a webinar format, so after our formal presentation, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so by typing it into the Q&A feature or the chat alongside of the screen. The Q&A feature tab can either be found at the top or at the bottom of the Zoom screen, depending on what device you're using right now. We'd also like to remind you that Eagle Eye Bookshop is our bookseller for this evening. So if you'd like to order a copy of the book, we will put a link to do that in the chat as well. And we thank you for your support of all of our independent booksellers, and especially our Black-owned bookstores and Black-owned businesses. This is such a very important time to support independent stores, and especially those Black-owned businesses and bookstores as well, especially during Black History Month. And we have a fantastic story for you this evening that reverberates even today with some of the themes and topics that we are dealing with as a society. Of course, the book is called A Shot in the Moonlight: How a Freed Slave and a Confederate Soldier Fought for Justice in the Jim Crow South. It's written by Ben Montgomery, who is a New York best-selling author of Grandma Gatewood's Walk. You may have seen him at the Decatur Book Festival in 2014, and we hope you did. He is the winner of the 2014 Outdoor Book Award, The Leper's Spy, and The Man Who Walked Backward. His most recent book, of course, is A Shot in the Moonlight, that tells the sensational story of George Denning, a freed slave who in 1899 joined forces with a Confederate war hero in search of justice. Ben spent most of the 20-year newspaper career as an enterprise reporter for the Tampa Bay Times, and now produces a daily letter for Axios on news and issues in the greater Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg area. He is the founder of narrative journalism website Gangry.com and helped launch Auburn Chautauqua, a Southern Writers Collective. He was also the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2010 and won the Dart Award and the Casey Medal for a series called For Their Own Good, about Florida's oldest reform school. Once again, we would like to welcome Ben here this evening to share with you this amazing true story. So right now, I would like to welcome Ben Montgomery.
Thank you so much, Joe and Allie, for your tech support. And thank you to the Georgia Center for the Book and the DeKalb County Library and all you folks for tuning in this strange time when guys like me show up on your computer screens and try to convince you to part with your 28 bucks to buy these things that we have spent a long time crafting and caring for. It's a weird way to try to sell books, but I'm coming to you from San Diego, California right now, where I'm doing some book events and some book sales, and I'm so happy to be with you. I don't want to delay very much. I'd like to get into telling the story because it's an incredible story, but I do just want to point out that the last few events that I've done, some of the Denning family has turned out. These are the descendants of the man at the center of my book. And if there are any Dennings out there, if you could just drop a note in the chat so that we might acknowledge your presence, that might help us all. And we'd love to maybe invite you, if possible, to join the conversation either through the chat or in other ways as tech allows. So in 1897, a man named George Denning was asleep in his house on a cold January night with his wife and about half of his 11 children. He had spent the evening tending to chopping wood and tending to the fire and then eating dinner and put his wife and kids to bed. There came a sort of commotion on the front lawn. The dog started barking. His wife, Molly, shook him awake, and he heard some men outside, and they were shouting for him to come outside. Again, this is January 1897. He refused to come outside. He went up to the door, but didn't open it. He said, "Who's out there?" They wouldn't identify themselves. Meanwhile, 25 men on horseback had ridden up to his house, and this was around midnight. And they demanded he come outside. He knew that if he came outside, there was going to be trouble. And so he refused. And eventually they began to shoot into his house because of his refusal to come outside. And a couple of men fired through his back door. He didn't know what was going on. If you could just imagine being awoken as a black man, as a freed slave in 1897 in southwestern Kentucky around midnight, one night when you were least expecting it, he was full of fear. And this is 5 years after the famed muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells sort of famously wrote in an editorial that the Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every black home to provide for us protection which the law refuses to provide. This was an era when lynchings were like clockwork. The newspapers at the time, if they mentioned black people at all, they were often in the paper because they were being marched to their deaths, often by a number of white people, ranging from 10 or 12 to sometimes thousands. And it just happened with such frequency that it was the fear of every black person living in the South that this was going to happen to them or could happen to them. And who had a shotgun of his own, I should mention, by the way, he farmed 114 acres peacefully. He had bought this acreage from the man who owned him, David M. Denning, which he had paid for fair and square after he was released in slavery. He was born into slavery in 1855 and then eventually emancipated. But he had bought this farm fair and square. He had receipts for everything. The men who stood outside on his lawn that night accused him of stealing. They said he had been accused of stealing livestock from neighboring farms, and they wanted to have a chat with him. But when they started firing into his house, he grabbed his own shotgun and he started to run upstairs. And he didn't know exactly what was outside. He couldn't see out the windows, but he started to run upstairs. And as he passed a window, he got shot in the left arm. A bullet just grazed his skin, but long enough, deep enough to make him bleed considerably. He ran the rest of the way upstairs and threw open the shutters and leaned outside. And as he leaned out the window, he took a bullet right in the forehead that grazed his forehead right here and made an entry wound and an exit wound about 3 inches apart. But as he did that, he squeezed off one round of birdshot from his double-barreled shotgun. And little did he know, but that birdshot would strike and kill the 32-year-old scion of the wealthiest farm family in southwestern Kentucky, a man named Jody Kahn. And this set in motion a sensational series of events that included George Denning running out of his house and hiding in a field out back until the men retreated to care for their wounded comrade. Denning ran to the home of a white neighbor, and unbeknownst to he didn't know that he had killed Jody Kahn, but he ran to the home of a white neighbor and said he'd been attacked. He thought at the time that the men had thrown dynamite into his house because the gunfire that followed his one shot of shotgun round was incredible and intense, and he thought they were bombing his home. And so he told this white neighbor that some men had shown up. He didn't know who they were, but he had fired one shot and they threw dynamite into his house. The next morning, he decided he would go back home to check on his wife and kids, and he just had to trust that the white men wouldn't come back for them. He went home or was on his way home when he met up with another black neighbor, a friend of his named Bob Lucas. And Bob Lucas said, "Hey, you've killed Jody Kahn." And this put all the fear in his heart. He immediately made his way 9 miles from Price's Mill, Kentucky, which is a rural town in southwestern Kentucky, all the way to Franklin, Kentucky, which is a county seat. And we're talking about 60 miles or so north of Nashville, if you can place this on a map. He turned himself into the sheriff, trusting the system, which often failed black people at the time. It was often the case that sheriffs just sort of rolled over to the lynch mobs and gave up prisoners, sheriffs and jailers alike. So he trusted this sheriff. He had done business with this sheriff in the past, and he just had to hope for the best. He turned himself in. Meanwhile, a mob was reconnoitering, if you will. They returned to George Denning's home, where his wife and kids were, and held them hostage for about 8 hours, hoping that George Denning would come back so they could lynch him. When Denning didn't return, the mob forced his wife and kids to flee the property, and they told him not to stop until they got out of the state of Kentucky. And so his wife and about 6 of his 11 children, one of them deathly ill, in the cold January chill, got on horseback and rode away to some family's home in Blackjack, Tennessee. And the mob, as they were fleeing, set fire to this 2-story cabin that George Denning had built with his own hands, and set fire to his barn and to his gear house and to his productive tobacco fields, basically ruining everything that he had worked his free life to build. The sheriff in Franklin was a good man, took care of George Denning. When he learned that a mob was coming to the jail to try to get George Denning out, he secretly stuck him in a carriage and took him over the barren farmland to Bowling Green, Kentucky. And when the jailer there received him, they brought in a doctor to examine his wounds, and the doctor made note of the wound in his arm and the wound in his forehead. And this would later come up during testimony at his criminal trial. When the jailer in Bowling Green learned a mob was gathering to come and get George Denning, he didn't have much. He didn't have much in terms of protection. So what he did was arm the other prisoners in the jail. He gave them all weapons and said, if somebody comes for this prisoner, do what you can to stop them. And so that never happened. The mob, it did assemble, but it never breached the jail. And so a few days later, George Denning was again ferried off from Bowling Green to Louisville, Kentucky, which was the sort of economic capital of Kentucky, and a place that he would be better protected, a place with a healthier, stronger Black population and more progressive politicians. So Denning waited in jail in Louisville until the local district attorney could bring charges against him. And this took essentially about 3 months. It turns out the mob that gathered that night at his house were the only witnesses to what happened, the only witnesses that could testify on behalf of the district attorney to bring charges against George Denning. Of course, his family was going to testify that they were the victims of a late night assault and gunfire from strangers they didn't know who'd gathered on their lawn. But the mob, in order to get a conviction, to bring charges against George Denning, had to out themselves, and they had to approach the DA and say, we knew, we were there that night, we know what happened. And they did this, but they did it with the confidence that an all-white jury in Franklin, Kentucky would convict this man who had done nothing more than defend himself and his family from assault. And if you just might imagine for a moment the audacity it would take to believe that that was the case. But those were the days when in a rural town you could get a conviction like that. And so these men who had attacked George Denning's house, many of them had returned the next day and burned his house to the ground, eventually approached the DA and agreed to offer their testimony to try to bring a murder conviction against this man who had just defended himself and killed one of their peers. And so they outed themselves, so to speak, at great risk, which we would later come to learn. So the trial went down that summer, the summer of 1897. An all-white jury eventually convicted George Denning, even though he and his 12-year-old daughter offered testimony as to exactly what they had done, what they had experienced that night. It didn't really matter, but the jury convicted Denning of manslaughter and not murder. Murder was the original charge. He was sentenced to 7 years of hard labor at the state prison at Eddyville, Kentucky. And immediately after the trial, he was shipped off to Kentucky. And what this did was when the story hit the newspapers, and it was a sensational trial, it was covered by papers like the New York Times, and all of the papers in Kentucky had correspondents there. So a lot of people were writing about this, and a lot of journalism was created out of this trial. And by the way, the governor of Kentucky, in order to protect George Denning during the trial, dispatched 2 units of National Guardsmen, of Kentucky militiamen, to protect the prisoner. Those men were under constant assault from hoodlums and ne'er-do-wells who were essentially trying to lynch George Denning again during his trial. Somebody threw dynamite at one of the at one of the outfits that was there to protect George Denning, and it wound up exploding in a lawn just across the street from them. So they were constantly under assault, but did their job in terms of protecting Denning. So after his conviction and after his sentence to prison, people both white and black across the state of Kentucky and from all walks of life, from railroad porters to school teachers to clergymen to rabbis, people from all walks of life came out in support of Denning's pardon and wrote letters to the governor of Kentucky, Bill O'Bradley, saying all this man did was protect himself. He deserves to be lionized. He is a hero. He is not a killer. He is not he should not be in state prison. And eventually they convinced Bradley, who happened to be a progressive Republican governor in this weird wave of progressive governors that occupied state houses in the South in the late 1890s. And Bradley, I think, knew personally that he had done a lot to protect Denning. He had ordered those National Guardsmen out. He had corresponded on a regular basis with all the various sheriffs that were involved in protecting Denning. He sort of looked at it like if we allow lynching to happen in the state of Kentucky, nobody's going to want to move here and nobody's going to want to do business here. It was an economic pursuit for him to try to prevent this lynching, as well as a humanitarian pursuit. He cared about the black vote. He had ridden the black vote into office. And so he cared about the outcome of this case. So Bill O'Bradley starts getting hundreds of letters from citizens of Kentucky and other places, including other southern states, from ex-Confederates, from city councilmen and so forth, white and black, saying, you must pardon this man. He has done nothing but defend his home and his family from attack. And he didn't waste any time. Within 7 days of Denning arriving at jail, Bill O'Bradley issued a pardon, and he did so secretly so that the mob couldn't show up there in Eddyville and try to abduct him. He had the jailer pardon Denning, let him out of prison, and gave Denning a one-way train ticket from Eddyville to Louisville. So Denning arrived in Louisville the next day, and he was celebrated by the black churches and the black community in Louisville. He became lionized. He was invited to go on a speaking tour. He spoke to the Odd Fellows. He spoke to the Fifth Street Baptist Church. And often these speeches from this man who was born into slavery, who could not read, could not write, his speeches would last for hours. There would be all sorts of questions directed at him from people who were beginning to lionize him, who viewed him as a hero for doing what he did, for standing up to a lynch mob or a mob of regulators. And so they collected offerings for him. They got him on his feet. He was able to buy a house in Jeffersonville, Indiana, which is just across the Ohio River from Louisville, where he quickly dispatched for his family to be brought so they could be taken over to over to Jeffersonville, where he was beginning to set up a home. While he was on this speaking circuit, he was approached by a man named Bennett Henderson Young. And Bennett Young was a white Confederate war hero who had grown up the son of a wealthy businessman who owned slaves himself. Bennett Young had fought for the South. He had ridden with Morgan's men on those raids into Ohio and Indiana. Bennett Young, interestingly, had conducted the northernmost land action in the Civil War, which was a raid from Canada into New Albans, Vermont. And you may never have heard of this. It's a very, almost, it's not forgotten, but there's not much information out there on it. Even though a book was written several years ago about it. Young passed himself off as he and some other Confederate soldiers stationed in Canada, and he came down into Vermont and passed themselves off as tourists and sportsmen. And they had the people of this unassuming, unsuspecting town of Vermont show them around and show them where the horses were and where the ammunition was and where the banks were. And they said, we're here to go hunting. And so like high noon on a Tuesday, they marched into a handful of banks. There were like 12 or 14 Confederate soldiers. They marched into these banks and they drew their guns and said, "We are Confederate soldiers and you are now our hostages. Give us all your money." And they gathered the whole town on the town square and they held them hostage essentially for about 24 hours before they rode off with somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 cash. And I think only one person died and it was accidental. But anyways, Bennett Young had led that raid. And after the war, he had moved to Europe before the president granted all the ex-Confederate soldiers amnesty. When he got a law degree in Europe, and when he was finally granted amnesty, he moved back to the United States and became a man about town in Louisville. He started a law practice. He became involved in railroads. He built railroads. He was an entrepreneur. The city of Louisville hired him to run the Louisville Exposition, which was like the World's Fair held in Louisville. He was a big deal. He was in the newspaper in the late 1890s. He was in the newspaper almost every single day for some business deal that he was involved in or something that he was doing. In the midst of all this, he became a champion for the Black cause. He represented pro bono Black men and women who were seeking justice in the federal court system. He founded an orphanage for Black children. So this guy who had fought so hard for the South had become a white guy. He'd become sort of a white savior, if you will, like a white guy who helped Black people along in the system. And Young, he knew about Denning's case. He'd been reading about it in the local newspapers in Louisville. And when he knew Denning was in town, he approached him and said, "I'd like to represent you in federal court." And they began fashioning a lawsuit against all the men who were in that lynch party who had outed themselves at George Denning's criminal trial. And eventually, when they filed this lawsuit, they asked the federal court for $50,000 in damages because these men had burned Denning's home to the ground and they had burned his fields and so forth. And so it was a sensational case. This had never happened before, when a Black man in the South had sued his would-be lynchers for damages. And Denning happened to be represented by one of the very best lawyers, maybe the best lawyer in all of Louisville at that time, in Bennett Young. The story was that other lawyers, that people off the street would, when they learned that Bennett Young was presenting a case, opening or closing arguments, they would just go into the courtroom and fill the courtroom just to hear him speak. He was a great orator, an entertainer, and this was the guy that stepped up to represent George Denning. Now, when word of that lawsuit started to get back to rural Simpson County, via the newspapers, which were reporting in sort of openly racist ways that this brute who had killed Jody Kahn, one of their own, their homeboy, that he now had the audacity to try to bring a federal lawsuit against the mob that had, the band of regulators that had tried to get him. They did so in a spirit of encouraging locals to take action into their own hands. And what happened on one night in 1898 that is lost to time, nobody was ever charged with this, nobody was ever brought to justice for this, but somebody found George Denning in the dark late one night, attacked him on a lonely street in Louisville, cracked his head open with a brick, gouged out one of his eyes, and left him for dead. He did not die. I found his medical records. It took him a long time to recover. He never regained use of his eye, so he only had one eye from that point on. But he eventually recovered and still pursued justice in the federal court. And because of this assault, I think you get the sense that Bennett Young went that much harder at this case in terms of trying to get this man some justice. So when the trial finally went down in 1899, Everyone who had testified in the criminal trial was again called to testify in the civil trial. Denning himself was, offered some testimony. His 12-year-old daughter offered some testimony and testified to the fact that bullets traveled through her hair, in her words, that night that men were shooting into her house. And Bennett Young delivered this incredible oration, a wonderful closing argument that was reprinted in a number of newspapers, saying if the jury lets these men off, then all the demons in hell will rejoice. That's the way in which he chose to present this as a moral issue, and ultimately, at the risk of giving away sort of the climax of this book, which I don't mind doing, they were successful. George Denning won his lawsuit against his lynch mob to the tune of $50,000, which is equivalent to about $1.5 million today. And it's the first time that I could find, or that any of my researchers could find, that had ever happened, that a jury had awarded a man who was this close to being the victim of a lynch mob anywhere near that amount of money from the people who were there to regulate him. It's not a super happy ending. I wish that he had been able to secure those proceeds and that money, because it would have helped him and his family in a big way. But he spent the next 20 years trying to get these white farmers to pay up. And many of them claimed they were indigent. They offered to spend time in jail rather than pay their fines. He continued to file lawsuits for 20 years and eventually got settlements from a number of them, but never anywhere close to the amount of $50,000. He reestablished himself in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and lived until his death in 1930. Unfortunately, I mentioned Anthony Denning earlier, and I don't know, Anthony, if you're on this call, but unfortunately, his grave has been lost. There was a flood at the cemetery where he's buried in Jeffersonville, Indiana, in the 1930s, and all the records were lost and the headstones were misplaced and things like that. And so his descendants don't know where he's buried. They know where his wife Molly is buried. She died about 10 years after he did, 14 years after he did. Her headstone is still there and they still care for it. But his grave has been lost to time. And just recently, somebody has made an effort to try to erect an historical marker, really since the book came out, an historical marker, at least there at the cemetery or somewhere in Jeffersonville, that acknowledges the courage of this brave man who just refused to die, first of all, and then beyond that, went in hot pursuit of justice, to try to set things straight for his family. And even after being attacked one night, having his head cracked open with a brick, having his eye gouged out, continued to fight for what he knew was right. And if you talk to his descendants, they know the story, and they live with that kind of defiance, if you will. They're very kind and polite people, but they do not get pushed around. They stand up for what is right, whether injustice becomes them or somebody they know, and they have for generations. And so if he has a legacy, then perhaps that's it. The sad thing about this is that period of, from like Reconstruction after the Civil War all the way through the Jim Crow era, and really through the sustained civil rights movements of the 1940s, 50s, 60s. There's so much of that history has been lost to time, or hasn't been explored in the way that we have looked at the 40s and 50s and 60s, because it's harder to get. It's not there. Of course, we have slave narratives and things like that, and there's been lots of research and studies done in that period of time. And then starting in the early 20th century, there's been lots of books written about that period. But from 1865 to 1910, there's just not a lot of material available to shed light on the courageous Black men and women upon whose bones the civil rights leaders that we celebrate this month and always would have stood, the Rosa Parks and the MLKs and so forth. And so it's my great pride and honor to bring this story forward and to try to establish maybe this guy that nobody's ever heard of, George Denning, as one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement, who defended his home, and then when things didn't go his way, trusted the system, and then fought back in legal means against those who wished ill of him and those who tried to kill him. And with that, I would love to read, and I'd love to take your questions too. So if you have them, please drop them in the chat. But I'd love to read a little part of this. And this is chapter 1, just to give you a flavor of the book, if you're interested in maybe picking it up. January 21st, 1897. And the chapter is titled, "The Whites Would Be Bent on Revenge." When the guns fell silent and the white men took cover, George Denning burst out the back of his little wooden house wearing only his undergarments. He ran through the frigid January air, and when he reached the tall grass of a nearby field, he hurled himself down flat on his back, his lungs heaving, his breath visible and rising beneath a moon almost full and what seemed to be a million stars poking through a smoky blue-black midnight sky. He lay still and quiet and listened to the men's voices coming from the north, beyond the house. They sounded at first as though they were in a state of consternation, but the voices grew distant as time slid by, suggesting retreat. When he could no longer hear the voices over the heartbeat in his own ears, he sat up slowly, looked around, then darted across the field toward his house. His wife met him at the door with his boots, his heavy coat, and his hat, and he dressed quickly without saying much, then turned away from the humble home that he had built with his own hands, the only home his children had ever known, the home he had defended, and he disappeared into the darkness. He ran, crashing through the near-freezing vegetation of southwestern Kentucky in close proximity to the Red River, which rolled silently west toward the Cumberland. He remembered the sight of his house surrounded by white men with guns, and he tried to puzzle out in his mind the last few minutes, for what had just happened would determine which action he next chose. Who were those men, and who among his neighbors could he trust? He made his way first to the farm of Gibb Hackney, a white man, a good man, he thought, a friend, who lived a half-mile away near the Tennessee state line. From the nighttime shadows, Denning bellowed, then waited, but he saw no light and heard no sound. He bellowed again, and the same silence followed, so he turned and ran. He cut through the field and forest, and the sounds of his footfalls carried through the night. A mile away at Price's Mill, he came upon the home of Zach Murray, another white man. Denning called out to him, and Murray appeared in the doorway with a lantern. Murray held the lantern up to the heaving black man standing before him and examined Denning in the firelight. He first noticed the shotgun in Denning's grip, one of 2 loads spent. He then saw blood oozing down Denning's face, and then the wellspring, a gunshot wound in Denning's forehead, as big around as the tip of his finger. He examined Denning's arm and saw where his undershirt had torn, and saw a wound about 1/4 inch deep and 1.5 inches long. Denning followed Murray inside. When he caught his breath, he explained to his neighbor the evening's events, lantern light dancing on the walls around them. He had eaten dinner at dusk. He'd hauled some wood in. He had stoked the fire. His wife, Molly, and children had climbed into bed. There was the baby, 4 months old, Emma, 3 years, Nanny, 4 years, Mertrude, 6 years, George Jr., 8 years, Viola, 10 years, and Eva, 12 years. He had drifted into a deep sleep and woke when Molly. He heard the dog barking outside, then voices. Then he heard someone call his name, George. The men accused him of stealing from smokehouses, and he protested, said upstanding white folks would speak on his behalf. That was when the bombs came. He thought they were bombs or dynamite because they came from above and sounded like someone had cast handfuls of gravel on the floor. Murray tried to set him straight, said he and his whole family would be dead if somebody had thrown dynamite into his little house. Whatever it was, Denning told Murray that he grabbed his shotgun and started up the stairs. And just as he passed a window, he felt a sharp pain in his arm and looked down and saw his own blood. He rushed upstairs and threw open the window at the foot of his daughter's bed. He felt a great pain in the center of his forehead, and he pointed his gun at what seemed to be a yard full of men down below. He squeezed, and the blast from his muzzle lit the night. The gunshot seemed to stop time for a split second, and a silence rushed over him, a silence that preceded a great deafening hail of explosions, of flying bullets, bullets flying over the heads of his children. Murray asked if he'd recognized anybody. Denning didn't know, didn't think so. The two men sat until 5 a.m., and Denning told Murray he'd better head back to the house to check on his family, to face whatever might come. Denning fetched his shotgun and headed toward the place he'd called home for 14 years, but his friend Bob Lucas intercepted him 100 yards away. Bob was a farmer, black, younger than Denning by 8 years or so, and he lived nearby. In fact, the men who'd come the night before had asked Denning if he knew where Bob Lucas was. He didn't, he said. The men told him they were looking for Bob Lucas too, and now here he was coming down the road before sunup, carrying devastating news. One of the men had been hit by George Denning's bird shot, Bob Lucas told him, in the cheek and the neck and the shoulder, had fallen from his horse in front of George Denning's house, had spilled blood in George Denning's yard, had passed in the night, George Denning's name on his tongue. "You shot Jody Kahn," said Bob Lucas. Denning knew Kahn, had done work for him, had no problems with the man, hadn't known he was there that night. Kahn was a wealthy farmer from the next county over, Logan. He was the 32-year-old scion of the Kahn family, and they would soon prepare his grave. There was no time to go home, not under the circumstances. The whites would be bent on revenge. He had to trust that they wouldn't harm his babies. He left the neighborhood on Friday for Franklin, the Simpson County seat, taking the Springfield Road the whole way, careful, scared, walking 9 miles. He left his shotgun with Dick Henry, a black man who lived on the outskirts of Franklin, and promptly turned himself in to Sheriff Bud Clark at the county jail, a foreboding stone fortress. News of the shooting beat Denning to the city, and the sheriff was already making plans to spirit him away. Clark loaded Denning into a buggy and started across the brown and barren country for Bowling Green in Warren County, some 20 miles away.
Ben, that was fantastic. Thank you so very much for sharing that with us. And we can all definitely see the journalistic style that you have. It definitely comes out in your storytelling. We do have a couple questions already in the chat. So once again, as a reminder, if you'd like to ask something, go ahead and either type it in the chat or the Q&A feature. I did notice someone had a hand up. Joyce, if you could go ahead and just type something into the chat or the Q&A and let us know what you wanted to ask, we'll go ahead and start with that. Real quick before we get started though, you are a journalist, so always know you're on the hunt and you have the ability to find a great story. But how did you find the story of George Denning? Because I am always fascinated by these little bits of history that kind of are. We work for a library system. It's like finding notes in books from years ago, and so they're finding photograph used as a bookmark in a book from years ago, and wondering, who this person is. And there's a bit of mystery, and you want to explore that. But in this case, this was very influential. This does have reverberations even to this day. So how did you happen to find out about George Denning?
My last big investigative series for the Tampa Bay Times was an effort to try to account for 6 years of police shootings in the state of Florida, statewide. And this all came to be because, basically because I learned after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, that no centralized organization kept track of the number of times citizens were shot by police. And I wanted to know that number, and it felt like it was attainable in Florida. So I asked 400 police agencies in Florida for 6 years worth of reports. Anytime an officer fired a gun and somebody was shot or killed, I wanted to know everything that happened around that shooting. And what this amounted to was 3 years of work. And I found myself living with these stories of tragedy. Out of the 831 shootings in the state of Florida, 40% of the victims of those shootings were Black, and that compares with about 15% of the Florida population, which was Black. And so I wound up falling in with a group of mothers of kids and husbands who had been killed by police. And because my newspaper job took up my daytime hours and my book work takes up my nighttime hours and weekend hours, I found myself longing for a story that didn't end in tragedy. And so, this didn't come to me organically. I sought this story out. And it took a lot of hunting through newspaper archives, using phrases such as Black retribution, revenge, keywords like that. And I would just read and read and read and read and read. And in the middle of this searching, I came across this story of George Denning and was compelled by the facts of the case. I hired a researcher in Kentucky to make a run to the state archives to see what source material might exist, to see if this was a story that had potential for a book. And she sent me a file, Jennifer P. Brown. She sent me a file with about 500 images that she had taken there at the state archives of the governor's papers. And it included the whole trial transcript during his criminal trial, and it included hundreds of letters that people had written to the governor of Kentucky after Denning was convicted. And so it gave me grounds to pursue this book with full force. And then, of course, I met the Denning family after that, and they, helped tell the story. They gave me, I hesitate to say I asked for permission because I was pretty far along, but I fell into their good graces, thank goodness. And I'm an interloper in this story, and I've said that every time I talk about it. I'm a white guy telling the story of a Black man and his family, but they gave me their full support in terms of telling this, and it felt like like it had been dormant for too long. And this is a story we're still talking about. I didn't mention this, Joe, but this guy Bennett Young, the ex-Confederate soldier who took on George Denning's case, he did more than any man of his era to promote the idea of the lost cause. All the Confederate statuary that we're now talking about and dealing with and trying to decide how do we remember these people and how do we remember the past? He had a hand in raising money for all of that. And if he didn't raise money for it, then he delivered the keynote address at the unveilings. That massive sort of phallic monument to Confederate President Jefferson Davis that stands in Western Kentucky, Bennett Young raised the money to build that thing. He was, even though he was representing Black people in court and founded a Black orphanage, he did more than, any of his contemporaries to help promote the lost cause and this idea that, that there was some chivalry, for these Southern soldiers, and that they should be remembered and honored by people who came after them. And so in him, you get this weird mixed legacy, this guy who, this guy did a lot for Black people. And in fact, there's a story in the Courier Journal about upon his death, all of the Black ministers in Louisville reached out and, said he was one of us. He helped us in big ways. And there's stories written about this, about how he had dedicated his life after the war to helping Black people. And at the same time, he promoted, he promoted the remembrance of the Confederacy that today we're still trying to figure out how we should regard a Confederate soldier, So I thought with all those elements in place, like this certainly has the makings of a book, and that's how it all came together.
Yeah, and that's extremely fascinating. We kind of even deal with that, in Georgia too, not only with monuments, but you have Margaret Mitchell, who written one of the biggest novels of the South, Gone with the Wind, and that has its problematic issues,
Right. Right.
But yet she donated money to Morehouse for Black doctors to get their degrees. I mean, and it's just, it's that strange. I mean, and who wrote? I can't remember the historian here who wrote the book. I just forgot her name. But they called the Margaret Mitchell House the tough little patch of history.
Oh wow!
It's up on Peachtree, and that is strange. I mean, it's fascinating that the romanticization of the lost cause, and but still he did all of those things for a community that was at odds with that romanticized ideal of the Cavaliers and the Southern Belles.
Yeah. He wrote a book called Confederate Wizards of the Saddle, and it was 600 pages of storytelling about the bravery of the Confederate soldier. And he believed this with his whole heart. He was a true son of the South. And, I came across a very prescient editorial in the New York Times that was written in 1864 as the Civil War raged. And it said, there will come a day in the distant future when slavery is regarded in the way that we now regard gladiatorial Rome. The barbarism of having men killed for sport. And it said, the men of our day will be judged on that distant day in the future, when they think of slavery in clear terms. The men of our day, the politicians of our day, and the leaders of our day will be judged on how they came down on that one issue, and nothing else will matter. And isn't this the period that we find ourselves in? How are we to regard people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, two faces on Mount Rushmore, who were slaveholders? We are now dealing with the thing that editorial proclaimed in 1864. How did you come down on the single issue that mattered in America at that time? Which is it okay to own another human being? It's so interesting.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, let's get to some questions, and I believe, Adele, I stole yours with where Ben came up with found this wonderful story and made this wonderful book out of it. But Joseph asks, we have two about the legal issues.
Sure.
So let me go ahead, and I'm going to kind of combine them into one question for you. So Joseph asks, did his attorney represent Mr. Denning for all those 20 plus years? And we'll follow that up with Nora's. Were other Black people in his original town affected by the death of the white man as backlash?
Yeah. Nora's first. Yeah. So they lived in an area called Price's Mill and also Coffee Bottom. And there were stories within the next few days after Denning had turned himself in and after the shooting that said that that the regulators had run off all of the Black people from that area. So I looked at the census numbers and I couldn't really tell if there was a big difference, in the 10 years, primarily because that was right up against the taking of another census. So, there would have been a census of 1890 and a census of 1900. And I couldn't tell a big difference in terms of the Black population in Simpson County, Kentucky. But if you believe the newspapers of the time, those same men went around looking for their own kind of revenge and chased off George Denning's Black neighbors. And then I'm sorry, Joe, would you mind just refreshing me on the first question that you asked? Did the same lawyer represent Denning for 20 years? Yeah, Bennett Young stayed with the case. And if it wasn't him, it was some lawyer in his firm. So all of the filings after that original victory were on behalf of George Denning were done by either Young himself or somebody who practiced law with him. He stuck with the case for a very long time.
And Joseph asked to follow up real quick. Did Mr. Denning still have a deed to his property?
So this was in an era when there was a fire in 1892 in Simpson County, Kentucky, at the courthouse that destroyed all of the property records. So he had a receipt, but it wasn't the same as a deed to the property. But there is no indication that he ever came back to Simpson County to try to reclaim that property. It was eventually sold at a tax auction, and now is owned by a sort of farm conglomerate that runs a bunch of farms in that area. I was able to figure out which slice of property it was, even though tree lines have changed since then, and the contour farmlands have changed. But yeah, the white people got George Denning's property, and he never tried to reestablish himself there. Anthony Denning, George's great grandson, who I've become friends with, said that he once went down to Simpson County to a family reunion, and his whole branch of the family had relocated up to Indiana. Anthony now in Indianapolis, and he said he tried to like reconnect with the people in their family down there, and just had such a hard time figuring out who was who and how they were related, because that bloodline had kind of been broken when the Dennings were driven off. They lost those connections, but in some ways they're still trying to puzzle all that out. Anthony spends a lot of time, his wife, I believe, is in the medical field. She's located in Utah, in Salt Lake City. And so he's constantly going out to Utah to visit her. And the Mormon Church has a family genealogical library, like one of the best in the world out there. And so he does his own research into the Denning family lineage, and tries to figure out who's who and what's what. And in fact, when I first met him, he brought a stack of papers about that thick of all the research that he had done into his great grandfather's story. So, that's the history there.
Yeah, and just a few comments as well. Vanessa says she's been looking at Young's Wikipedia page and finds something very Mark Twainish about him and his story. And of course, Mark Twain was helped bring to light the issues of racism in the South.
And Twain, I might add, I opened the book. What are these called, Joe? And is it epigraph? I should know this. I'm an author. I've done 4 books. Epigraph, right?
Yes.
There's a Mark Twain. It's satirical, but I think it's powerful. He says, Twain writes, "All being ready now, and the darkness opaque, the stillness impressive, for there should be no sound but the soft moaning of the night wind and the muffled sobbing of sacrifices. Let all the far stretch of kerosene pyres be touched off simultaneously, and the glare and the shrieks and the agonies burst heavenward toward the throne." You're right that Twain did a lot of writing about the South and about the problems of lynchings.
Michael offers a comment too. He was reminding us of another forgotten story called "On the Laps of Gods" by Robert Whitaker, which is about a race massacre in Arkansas in 1919, and the subsequent legal battle that ultimately saved a number of sharecroppers who were convicted of murder and freed by the federal courts. And also, just a reminder to everyone too, coming up 2021 is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre this summer.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And if you check out the book "The Burning" by Tim Madigan, it's a great place to start for the Tulsa Massacre. We're now coming to terms with these things. I grew up in Oklahoma. I was born in St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I never heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre until I was an adult. I taught in history class, or wasn't when I came through school. Nor were the facts about the Oklahoma land run and the theft of Indian territory from the natives, Americans who had been promised that land from the federal government. When I was 5th grade, we dressed as pioneers. It was 1989, and the celebration of the centennial of the land run, and they took us across the street to a big field, and fired a gun or said go or whatever. We all ran across the field and we got to scat our turf and sit down and have our picnic lunch. And then we, went in for the day. But they never mentioned in class that land was stolen, that had been promised to Native Americans who'd been taken by at gunpoint hundreds of miles from the Southeast and relocated in Oklahoma. And said, here's where you'll live for the rest of your lives, for generations to come. And then within, a short amount of time, they opened that to settlement by people. We're just now, I feel like, coming to this place where we're starting to reconsider racial perspective on history. And you see this with things like the 1619 Project from the New York Times and some fantastic work that's being done by journalists and historians to take into account the contributions of Black citizens during slavery and after slavery, that expands that horizon, those contributions from people like that we've always known about, like Booker T. Washington and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and so forth. It expands that to include regular everyday people who made important contributions to what this country would become, and who have always protested the bad part of America, the bad part of racial white supremacist America, who have always stood up and said, this is our country too. And this pandemic has sort of put all this on hold, but we saw that early last year with these incredible Black Lives Matter protests, where we're all collectively now saying we're not going to stand for this anymore. We're not going to deal with the oppression anymore, and with the murder of people like Breonna Taylor, which we were just taught the injustice of that. And I make the book, or try to, in the opening letter of the book, that the Civil War never really ended. It just evolved into a number of different kinds of skirmishes, and they take place on Facebook and in high school hallways, and after dark, during no-knock service of no-knock warrants. And I mean, it's playing out in different ways, right? But this is what we're dealing with right now. So it's a subjective thing to say about this. It's up to all of us to be alert and be vigilant to those negative waves that sweep through America once in a while, that try to reestablish one race's superiority over the other. And for those of us who are smart, to realize that, like, we're in this together, and it's our duty to honor the experiences of people who don't look like us.
Yeah, and I do have the preface pulled up because it's a goodie, and I'm going to steal your words, sir.
Sure.
So from the preface, it says, the problem with the Confederate flag and the granite statues of dead soldiers is that the Civil War never ended. It rages on Facebook and in classrooms and in the streets of American cities still. Its agents of trouble are Proud Boys and good old boys, and police with no-knock warrants, and whites who should know better but choose silence.
Amen.
Remarkable. So Joseph asks, what is your next writing project?
Well, I just took a job with Axios Tampa Bay, which is a new media venture. I'm doing a daily newsletter, and right now it's all I could handle. I do have a ghostwriting project in the works, but I can't really talk about it. The day will come, and then I'll be pitching another book here pretty soon, I bet. Maybe I'll take a little pause for the rest of this year, but I want to return to these types of stories. A lot of people have read Grandma Gatewood's Walk. Thank goodness. It's a book about the woman who pioneered the Appalachian Trail. She's the first woman to ever solo through hike the Appalachian Trail, which leaves there from Georgia at Springer Mountain and runs all the way up to Maine. She was a total badass. She did the first hike at the age of 67. She was a victim of domestic abuse for 30 years beforehand. And so it's a story of a powerful woman. I want to do more books that deal with the sort of foundation issues of racism, and tell them, find stories that allow us to illuminate those issues that we're dealing with today in unexpected ways and in factual and truthful ways. that are approachable to people who prefer fiction, who like to read good stories well told. I think that's what good narrative journalists can bring to this conversation. We can write these stories that existed in the past by gathering all the facts and not assuming anything, just taking all the stack of facts and doing hard hard and laying these stories out in a way that's compelling, that brings readers in, doesn't bore them, doesn't waste their time, and takes them all the way through a 300-page book, and makes them, when they're done, realize like, oh God, I'm glad I read that. Now I know something about America that I didn't know. So whatever I do next, hopefully it'll be along those lines.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Michael says it's very informative. There are so many stories of heroism and injustice that have been lost and are yearning to be rediscovered. Which is, I mean, we look around in our little towns and things like that, and you can find some remarkable stories. And speaking of the Appalachian Trail, because I know it's Springer Mountain to Katahdin, but if you're going to do a through hike, they should start it in April. I'm originally from West Virginia, so
April or May. Yeah.
So you can kind of get there.
Weather gets bad about late September, early October. Weather gets bad on Mount Katahdin, and you run the risk of them shutting the trail down. So that would be terrible to get all the way up there and not be able to finish. But yeah, most people start in April, and anymore, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which aims to protect the trail and also to give hikers good experiences, they have begun encouraging what they call a flip-flop hike, where you start in Georgia, hike all the way to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, where the ATC is headquartered, and then you can get a shuttle to Mount Katahdin and hike back and finish at Harpers Ferry. So it's called a flip-flop hike, but the problem was there were too many people now who are trying to hike the Appalachian Trail, and they all start at the same time and they all finish at the same time. And so it's causing some destruction to ecologically sensitive areas and things like that. So they're always looking for ways to make that trail healthy and keep it around for future generations.
Okay, I mean, it's wonderful. Interesting fact that about it is like, West Virginia is the only state in Appalachia completely in the Appalachian Mountains, but that trail barely grazes Harpers Ferry. It's like, if you're in historical Harpers Ferry, it's like, oh, it's down there. It's not even through Harpers Ferry.
Right.
But I mean, that's such a wonderful town to visit too. I've been there several times, and seeing the armory where John Brown's raid occurred was just amazing. I always, going back as an adult, that's what's interesting about being an adult and revisiting history. It's like you kind of get shuttled there as students, and you look at it, you kind of do the tour, but then when you go back as an adult, it just didn't seem as massive, and you're looking at it and wondering, these men were huddled in this building that is literally half the size of my current home, and it's like, this was a federal arsenal where all of this was taking place. And, just like the story that you can imagine, the bullets had to be whizzing, past these people. And
if you haven't seen it, Showtime, I believe, has a limited series now called The Good Lord Bird, which is based on a Prizewood historical piece of historical fiction, a book of historical fiction by the same name, that imagines the raid on Harpers Ferry by John Brown, and tells the story from a young boy who's mistaken for a young girl by John Brown, and winds up traveling with Brown for the weeks and months leading up to that raid at Harpers Ferry. I thought it was great. It's Stephen Hawke. And if you can just suspend your disbelief for a little bit, and accept that this is historical fiction, it's such a cool thing to watch. I had a really interesting viewing experience. So if you get the chance, check that one out.
I will have to. That was actually James McBride. He gave a wonderful lecture for us years ago over at the Baptist Church, and he brought he had traveled with the band, so it was a literary and musical presentation.
Oh wow!
fascinating. I mean, I think everyone was completely floored, but it worked so well with, not, it wasn't for the Good Word Bird, but a book before that. And it worked so well thematically to have these musical elements tied in with the narrative of the book. But yeah, another amazing, historical fiction, true, but another amazing book as well. So, well, Bet, I don't want to keep you from the rest of your evening plans, but thank you so much for sharing this very, very important story. Once again, if you all would like to order a copy of A Shot in the Moonlight, you can do so from Eagle Eye Books. They are ready to take those orders. They do have curbside pickup and ship to home available, so you can look for those two options as well. And apparently Adele was from Boston, so thank you for joining us from Boston. I think it may be snowing in Boston. It's snowing most places except in Tennessee and Georgia. I think that's the only two places where it's not snowing right now.
Southern California.
So okay, there we go. There's patches, but for the most part, the United States is blanketed with snow for some odd reason this week. But thank you all so much for allowing us to come into your homes this evening and share this great story with you. Please stay safe, enjoy Black History Month, share Black stories, and remember, Black lives and Black businesses matter. Thank you all so much for coming, and we will see you all very soon.
Thank you so much.